What's the best type of campaign prep that you can do as a DM? The kind where the players do the work for you, of course. Today, we're flipping traditional campaign prep on its head. And trust me, once you try it this way, I don't think you're ever gonna wanna go back. We're continuing my Campaign Building 101 series. So if you missed last week's video, you might wanna go check that out after, because today we are building on some of those ideas. Unfortunately, this time there are no forms. I know, you're disappointed. But don't worry, I have something even better. Not only will this tool make world building prep so much easier, but it also guarantees your players will be obsessed with your campaign. Enter the Player Campaign Guide. Wait, don't campaign player guides come after the world building, you may be asking? Not for me. A lot of DMs spend hours crafting every detail before they even really start to think about their players. I do the opposite. And by the end of this video, you'll see why this backwards approach doesn't just save time, it also creates better campaigns. See, at this stage in my campaign prep, I don't have a fully fleshed out world. What I do have is a list of cool ideas that I wrote in my notebook and the information that I've gathered from my players through the questionnaire. That's it, and that's intentional. Because instead of guessing what my players might find cool, I let them tell me. I want to know what excites them, what kind of stories they want to tell, what kind of worlds they're interested in exploring. Because then I build out from there. So some of this comes from the questionnaire, but a lot of it comes from this next step, character creation. The more I help my players create great characters, the less world building work I really have to do. Think about it. Every choice a player makes about their character is an opportunity. What class they pick, what background they chose, what sort of goals their character has. Each of those choices hands me plot hooks and world building prompts, so I don't have to just pull ideas out of thin air. And the result? We have a shared world that they're already invested in before they even start playing in their first session. So yeah, if you thought forums were a lot, you'll probably think that campaign guides are overkill too. But trust me, they are a game changer when it comes to player engagement. And I'll show you exactly how I do it, because here's the real goal. If the players create characters that are so deeply tied into our world lore, my job as a DM becomes so much easier. But here's where it gets a little bit interesting, because we're not just letting the players shape the world, we're using their choices to completely reverse engineer a whole campaign. For example, let's say you know your world is full of mysteries and a player, one who registered high interest in exploration and combat, builds a ranger from a family of monster hunters. Boom, they just handed you your story. Even if they didn't flesh anything else out, you already know they want adventure, they want danger, they want a reason to go out into the world to explore. And so by blending their input with your world building ideas, you're setting up a game they can't wait to play in. And here's something a lot of DMs might not realize. Creating a player campaign guide subtly teaches your players how to play in your world. Because D&D, even though it's one of many TTRPG systems, isn't really just one game. It's not this set thing like Monopoly. It can be a ton of different games depending on the group. And this goes beyond things like settings and house rules. It really just goes to the core of how we as DMs choose to run things. So your guide steers them towards the playstyle that fits your campaign. Maybe you're more character driven, maybe you love tactical combat. Either way, your campaign guide helps steer them towards creating the type of character that will be fun to play in your campaign. You help teach them how to have the most fun in your world. So, how do we actually make one of these magical player campaign guides? Let's dig in. Okay, so first we're gonna open our Notion pages. You can totally use something like Obsidian instead if you prefer. I just prefer web-based applications because I personally need things to be a little more ADHD friendly. And so down below, I've actually made a player campaign guide template, a template for you guys to use. So totally free. You just click on the little dots in the corner and you can duplicate it to your own Notion setup. And so now what I'm showing you guys, this is a player portal that I made for my group that's playing in kind of an Underdark, Reverse Atlantis meets Arcane style campaign. You can see I've included like a little greeting, and that's because I have had some people in that campaign that never played D&D before. So I wanted to make sure they felt welcomed and excited and had access to the resources they needed, because learning to play D&D can feel scary and overwhelming. But the real starting point for your player campaign guide is the one-page campaign guide. So if I was playing with a group of experienced players, I would actually just put the one page right here front and center so it's the first thing that they see. And if you're not familiar with this, this is a tool from Mike Shea of Sly Flourish, who, if you've watched my videos before, you know is a huge influence on the way I prep. But the idea is simple. Players probably won't read more than one page, if they read one page at all. So if you want to get them on board, you need to keep it brief but impactful. This is also where the results of our player questionnaire comes in. I'll usually take that data and turn it into cute little graphs because I'm very normal and like data a totally normal amount. Very, very normal. And you definitely don't need to do that. But I'll review it a little bit. I look at individual answers. I especially look at outlier answers. So if someone really hates something but likes this one aspect of combat or something, I look for their outlier answers. I also look for strong commonalities. And what I'm doing here is just looking for important threads to pick up on in terms of what individual players like, but also what the table as a whole like, what their overlap is. I think I said in the last video, I'm looking for kind of like those little heat islands. I might also keep like my notes app open in the corner with a few source material points. So if all of my players listed Arcane as a piece of media that inspires them, I want to make sure I'm keeping that influence clear while I'm thinking about building out this one page. And while I'm writing this guide, I'm constantly asking myself, does this fit the flavor of my group? And if you remember in the last video, I talked about like my brand name, the idea of the web walkers. That means this campaign guide needs to fit that idea of traversing a web of exploration and intrigue and monsters. So when I write this guide, I want to include a central premise, a campaign thesis, so to speak. And this can shift through play, but what's the initial goal of the campaign? I also want to add, this is usually where I make the first really big decision other than like the flavor of this campaign, but how long do I want this campaign to be? So you don't want to write a campaign premise that sounds like it'd be a trilogy of movies if what you really just want is a single really cool episode of an anime, you know? Make sure the scope fits what you're imagining the length of the campaign is. Next, I might note important factions, allies, patrons, who's important in the world at the start of this campaign. Then I'll add in the starting location, where in the world are they, what key information do they need to know about it while creating their characters. And I'll also add in some key world truths. What defines this world, and especially what sets it apart from other worlds? What's different enough to note? And then finally, I'll usually add in character creation guidelines. So what specifically makes a good PC for this campaign? Example, my campaign is set in Kree-La, an Underdark city with a massive wealth gap and an artifact that could reconnect them with the surface world. And you can see in the little intro, I set up the idea of it being a campaign about finding the Luminara crystal. I set up the idea that there are different potential patrons looking for it, and I set up factions of believers versus non-believers when it comes to the crystal. Then I give them a little bit of information about the city of Kree-La and world truths, which is sowing some plot hooks for character creation, right? And just generally walking through the basics of character creation for them. And in this section, you shouldn't be afraid of explicitly stating that they're building a certain type of adventurer, especially if it's crucial to the premise of your campaign. You can see that I don't tell them they need to believe the crystal is real, They just need to be someone who's invested in the chance to find it. And I even outline different ways they can go about this so that when adventure calls for them, the most basic thing they will have need to done is create a character that is ready to say yes. Say yes to adventure, please. But the point of all of this is that players don't need a full world Bible. They just need enough to spark ideas and get them invested. And that's where the second part of the player campaign guide comes in, the all-important character creation options. And we will get to that in a second, but before we do, I'd like to include a little something extra, because while some players are more than happy with just the one-page guide, some do crave just a little bit more. So I like to think about how to give them that without overwhelming either newer or more casual players. And for me, it's all about keeping information concise, relevant, and most importantly, actionable. So some of the things I like to include depending on the campaign are short blurbs about nearby locations, important factions, key NPCs. Sometimes I'll include like a little city map or just more information about the starting area. But whenever I'm adding any player-facing world-building information, I ask myself, what kind of plot hooks is this creating? We don't want lore just for the sake of lore here. We want lore that helps players create interesting characters. And besides world info, I usually add in a few other more practical sections, house rules or homebrew mechanics that might impact gameplay, how-to resources for new players, since I tend to bring in a lot of first-timers. You can see some familiar faces here. We have Ginny D, we have Pointy Hat, we have Wazdy. I like to include a backstory builder section for players who like a little more guidance and a little bit more inspiration when it comes to creating their player characters. For my campaign, I used the Session Zero system by Elise Resendez. Unfortunately, I cannot share that with you directly, but I'll link to it below. Another really great resource for this is the Game Master's Handbook of Proactive Role-Playing. It has a lot of fantastic tips that help guide your players towards creating compelling characters with concrete goals. No weird abstractions. And again, these are just optional extras depending on the needs of your group. But when adding any extra world lore, really remember, keep it simple and keep it plot hook oriented. But now we've reached the part where it gets even better, because the real magic, that happens in character creation. And if you do it right, your players won't just make cool characters, they'll create stories that basically write your campaign for you. So let's talk about how we make that happen. Now, let's be real, when your players open this guide, they're not starting with the setting details. They're skipping straight to, can I be a dragonborn wizard? And you can't blame them. Like, we all know going over character options is the most fun part. Unless you have veteran players who just stick to their favorites, most players will pore over their class, ancestry, and background options. And that, my friends, is a huge opportunity. If you just list out their choices and set them loose, you're missing out. Because if you're only using WotC's default descriptions, you risk ending up with a party of generic adventurers who feel like they've just been teleported in from a different setting. But if you tweak that flavor just a little bit, suddenly you've planted plot hooks that make your world feel alive. So let's pull up some examples. Ancestries are one of the best places to bring in more world flavor. You can see I have some of the OG classics, some Underdark staples, but I also brought in a few fun Pathfinder ancestries for this campaign. And honestly, it was a pretty easy shift, and I actually really like how in-depth some of their descriptions are. Take the Ysoki. I barely had to tweak them, and they already fit this campaign perfectly. I also always use Tasha rules for character creation because I prioritize interesting characters over whether or not the idea of a super strong gnome is realistic in my make-believe game of heroic fantasy. So even though some of the ancestries I ported in have ability scores, my players know they don't have to pay attention to them. And then I just add abilities in that are on par with the other ancestries and make sense flavor-wise. But on the other hand, let's talk about the standard WotC halfling. You read the default description and yeah, it doesn't really fit this setting. And yeah, sure, like one option is to just cut them. But instead, I usually see if there's an opportunity to make small, deliberate tweaks that really reinforce the world building of this campaign. Because while the idea of forests and farms that are woven into halfling lore might clash a bit with my Underdark lore, the general idea of the halfling, of being a creature of home and community versus ones that are more nomadic, we can keep that and work with that. That itself fits. So I'm gonna go in and highlight these bits that make the halfling description feel off in terms of this world. Now, how can I change these things that I've highlighted? Let's look at this line. Lured by the open road and the wide horizon to discover the wonders of new lands and peoples. No open roads here, no wide horizons, only Zool, but behold, a chance for a switch that helps plant plot hooks that make sense. So I don't know how many clashing armies this campaign would have either, so I'm gonna change this right here. I'm going to change it to dangerous bandits, and instead of being lured by the open road, we're gonna change that to lured by the wondrous opportunities that exist in the many unexplored tunnels to discover new plants, creatures, and peoples. So see how this tiny edit can suddenly make them feel so much more at home in this world? And like this section, the section right here, pastoral pleasantries, large farms and open groves. Not gonna work. Pastoral pleasantries obviously are going to look very different down here. But I actually have a place built out that would make a ton of sense to pair with this idea of a pastoral life that a halfling might seek out. Because what about small family farms in Kwa, a quiet Underdark settlement? So we're gonna say that many halflings prefer a quieter life than the one that the city of Krila provides. Instead, gravitating towards the farming town of Kwanma. They often set up small family farms that specialize in growing rare mushrooms, catching fish, or raising giant insects for food. Many families tend to keep to themselves, preserving their traditional ways and removing themselves from the busy political lives of those more interested in the city's governance. Then this next part is yet another opportunity. Instead of traveling as a way of life, driving wagons and boats and stuff, we know that people go back and forth between the sister cities trading goods. And we know that Kwanma is on a really big lake where there's tunnels connecting to it. So we're gonna say halfling communities travel as a way of life, driving wagons between the sister cities, or guiding boats through the tunnels connected to the lake in the center of Kwanma, maintaining no permanent home. Same essence, totally different flavor. And this is how you weave the world into character creation without adding walls of text. And I'll just go through all of the options I'm offering up to players doing this. And it can seem overwhelming at first, but it really doesn't take that long because all we're really doing is identifying these friction points and turning them into plot hook opportunities instead. You don't really need to rewrite anything entirely from scratch unless you truly feel called to do so. So same idea with the classes. Some classes will fit seamlessly, like rangers, basically already perfect, just swap out mentions of forests for caverns. Clerics, though, in this campaign, they might need a bit more work. And you can actually see that I used to do this a little differently. This has been a process that I've been honing over different campaigns for a little while now. I used to be extra nuts and created PDFs so I could add little borders and use specific fonts. I'm much more normal now. I used to have footnotes about flavor changes and I'd link out to this different subclasses. That was the way I tried to make things easier for myself. But now I keep everything in-house. So having everything here on one platform, even though it takes a little bit of time to set up, gives me full creative control over my campaign. So now what I'd consider doing for this campaign is cutting down the domain options to just knowledge, arcana, forge, life, twilight, and instead of the light domain cleric, we have sun catchers. I wouldn't even list these other ones now. If a player really wants to play something other than the selections I'm offering, I have notes kind of sprinkled all over these player campaign guides to come talk to me, and we can probably figure out some flavor tweaks that can work for what they imagine playing. But I really want them to be thinking about these options that I've gotten creative with first. So if a player picks to play as a light domain cleric / sun catcher, I'd write a short blurb explaining how sun catchers function in this world and create some guidance if this was a plot hook that they wanted to engage with. And that one tweak takes an existing subclass and makes it deeply tied into the setting. I might even spend time connecting the knowledge domain to the story like this by working in plot hooks that have to do with the start of this world, the idea of whether or not there's really more out there, a surface world, that sort of thing. But backgrounds can be gold mines for plot hooks too. So, take the folk hero. We have a bunch of mentions of peasants and farms. Again, not super relevant to this campaign. So instead, right here, instead of I stood up to a tyrant's agents, we can make it I stood up to a corrupt council member's agents. Boom. Now it's hyper relevant, and I have a built-in NPC to mess with that player. Because let's be honest, do we think that corrupt council member just forgot about them? Oh no, that's coming back. So hopefully you can see just how powerful a player campaign guide can be. It's not just about giving players options, it's about shaping their choices to create better stories. By giving your players all the information that they need for character building all in one place, you're really doing yourself the favor. You're creating this opportunity to control the plot hooks that you put out. Because when players come in with strong world-connected characters, your campaign basically writes itself. So instead of throwing out a dense lore Bible, we're guiding our players through world building in a way that feels effortless. And if you want to get started, don't forget to grab my Notion template below. Because next up, I'm going to show you guys how I've finalized characters with my players and use their backstories to shape out the majority of my world building. That way I know exactly what we need before we start playing. So don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you haven't yet, make sure to check out these videos next.